They laughed. In Tokyo's war rooms and naval academies, Japan's admirals and strategists mocked the idea of American bombers ever reaching their fleet. "They fly too far, too slow, and hit nothing," one officer reportedly joked. To them, air power was a weapon of harassment, not destruction. In 1942, when American planes struck Tokyo for the first time under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, the damage was minimal. A few fires, a handful of deaths, little more. Yet to the Japanese command, it confirmed their beliefs. America, they thought, was clumsy, emotional, a giant with wings, but no aim. But what they didn't see was what came next. Behind the ridicule, in secret bases across the Pacific, American engineers, strategists, and pilots were rewriting the science of destruction. They were turning lumbering bombers into instruments of precision. They studied weather patterns, aircraft formations, fuel efficiency, and bombing altitude with the obsession of men determined to strike back. And when they returned, they would not miss. This is the story of how Japan underestimated a nation's resolve, and how American innovation turned laughter into silence, steel into ash, and the Imperial Navy into a memory beneath the Pacific waves.
Act 1. The Empire's Confidence. This act sets the stage, Japan's early naval supremacy and its arrogance toward American air power in the first years of the Pacific War. In 1941, Japan stood at the height of its empire. Its navy was vast, modern, and disciplined, a machine of precision honed through years of doctrine and victory. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered America's illusion of safety, and for months afterward, Japan ruled the seas unchallenged. From Singapore to the Philippines, from the Dutch East Indies to Burma, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. Japanese commanders viewed the Pacific as their dominion, the Imperial Navy as untouchable, and within their ranks, a dangerous belief took root, that America's industrial strength was meaningless without spirit, that their soldiers lacked the will for sacrifice. In the words of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no confidence." It was both prophecy and warning, one his superiors ignored. Japan's naval philosophy was rooted in tradition, victory through decisive battles between ships, not aircraft. Carriers and battleships were extensions of samurai honor, not tools of attrition. Air warfare was still an accessory. When American bombers appeared on radar, Japan's commanders scoffed. Their anti-air defenses were light, their reconnaissance networks fragmented, and their radar technology primitive compared to what the Americans would later deploy. The Doolittle raid in April 1942, 16 B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet didn't change any of that. Though it barely scratched Tokyo's surface, it wounded Japan's pride. Yet instead of respecting the threat, their leaders doubled down on arrogance. "The Americans," one naval officer said, "are children playing with fire." But the Americans kept studying. Every missed target, every fuel miscalculation became a lesson. Every wrecked plane taught them more about range, altitude, and precision. Japan laughed at their failures, not realizing that in war, every mistake is a teacher, and every lesson has a cost.
Act 2. Fire from the Sky, America's New Doctrine. This act explores how America's early bombing failures became the foundation of a revolutionary new strategy, one that would turn air power into the decisive weapon of the Pacific. After the humiliation of Pearl Harbor, America was a nation burning for retribution. Yet rage alone couldn't win a war. The Doolittle raid had proven something both inspiring and sobering, that American bombers could strike Japan, but not effectively, not yet. It was a symbolic success, not a strategic one. But within the failures of those early missions lay the seeds of a new kind of warfare. In laboratories, airfields, and makeshift Pacific bases, engineers and commanders began asking a question no one had before. What if air power could destroy not just ships or soldiers, but the very engines that fed an empire? That question reached the desks of generals like Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Arnold knew that to win the Pacific War, the U.S. had to cripple Japan's ability to build, refuel, and move, not just sink its ships. To do that, he needed reach, accuracy, and endurance. The result was a revolution in metal, the B-29 Superfortress. It was unlike anything that had flown before, a pressurized four-engine giant capable of carrying 10 tons of bombs over 3,000 miles. It could fly higher than any Japanese fighter and reach deep into the Japanese mainland. But it was more than an aircraft. It was a statement that America would fight not through proximity, but through possibility. The first B-29 bases rose in India and China, carved out of mountains and jungles by thousands of local laborers and U.S. engineers. The operations were codenamed Matterhorn. From these distant outposts, the Americans began launching missions over the Himalayas, the infamous hump, to strike the industrial centers of Japan. At first, the results were disappointing. Clouds scattered bombs, high winds ruined accuracy, and Japan's dispersed factories made targeting difficult. Commanders argued, crews suffered. Dozens of bombers vanished into storms or anti-aircraft fire. But each failure made them sharper. They learned to read the jet streams, to measure drop trajectories by wind and temperature, to calculate timing with mathematical precision. They experimented with new bomb types, high-explosive clusters for shipyards, incendiaries for factories, armor-piercing ordnance for dockyards. By late 1944, a new name was whispered through Japan's defense circles: Curtis LeMay, the ruthless, brilliant commander of the 21st Bomber Command. LeMay didn't care about tradition or prestige. He cared about results. His crews called him Iron Ass, but even they admitted he made their bombs hit. LeMay transformed chaos into coordination. He rewrote formation tactics, adjusted bombing altitudes, and replaced scattered precision attacks with low-altitude, concentrated fire raids. He turned air war into an algorithm, and soon that algorithm would burn the Imperial Navy's heart out of the sea.
Act 3. The Flames over Tokyo. This act reveals how America's bombing strategy evolved into one of the most devastating air campaigns in history, the firebombing of Tokyo, and how Japan's leaders finally began to understand what they had unleashed. In early 1945, Tokyo still believed itself untouchable. The Imperial General Staff, hidden in underground bunkers, insisted that the capital's vast sprawl of wood and paper homes could not be seriously damaged by bombs. Even as American B-29s began raiding industrial cities like Nagoya and Kobe, Japan's air defenses remained scattered and slow. But General Curtis LeMay saw what others did not. He understood that Japan's cities were its factories. Entire neighborhoods produced tools, uniforms, and weapons from their homes. Tokyo wasn't a single target. It was millions of them, packed together under a dry winter sky. LeMay's new doctrine was brutal and simple. If you can't hit a needle, burn the haystack. On the night of March 9th, 10th, 1945, he put that theory to the test.
over 300 B-29s took off from the Mariana Islands, each loaded not with high explosives, but with M69 incendiary clusters, bombs designed to ignite and spread fire rather than explode. They approached Tokyo at low altitude, just 5,000 feet, to increase accuracy. The first wave dropped marker flares, bright white, carving the city into targets. Then came the fire. Within minutes, the capital turned into a furnace. The wind, funneled through narrow streets, became a weapon, feeding the flames until they merged into a storm of heat and smoke. Pilots reported the glow visible 150 miles away. The firestorm grew so intense that it created its own wind, uprooting trees, flipping cars, and sucking oxygen from the air. Below, tens of thousands of people fled into rivers and canals, only to suffocate or boil alive. Firefighters dropped their hoses and collapsed. One Japanese survivor later said, "The sky fell that night." By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been erased. Over 100,000 civilians were dead, more than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And Japan's leadership finally understood that what they had dismissed as American clumsiness had evolved into something beyond imagination, a science of annihilation. The next day, LeMay's crews returned to their bases, silent. They had seen the city burning beneath them like the surface of the sun. Many vomited, some cried, others simply stared at the ground. LeMay himself did not celebrate. He only said, "If we lose this war, I'll be tried as a war criminal." But the strategy worked. Tokyo's production capacity collapsed. The Imperial Navy, already starving for fuel and parts, began to suffocate. The factories that repaired its ships were ash. The airfields that protected them were gone. Japanese admirals laughed at America's bombers. Now there was nothing left to laugh about.
Act 4. The Fleet That Couldn't Rebuild. This act explores how the destruction of Japan's industrial infrastructure, shipyards, refineries, and transport hubs crippled the Imperial Navy beyond repair, long before the final bombs ever fell. The Imperial Navy had once been the pride of Japan, sleek, disciplined, invincible. Its battleships, the Yamato and Musashi, were marvels of engineering, steel fortresses that could hurl shells the weight of cars across miles of ocean. Its carriers had ruled the skies at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and the early days of the Pacific War. But by 1945, those same ships floated like stranded giants, starved of oil, spare parts, and ammunition. Every fleet needs a heartbeat, and Japan's heart had been its industrial web. The ports of Kure, Yokosuka, and Nagasaki, the steelworks of Osaka, the oil refineries of Tokuyama and Yokkaichi, the aircraft foundries in Nagoya. Each of these was now either burning or silent. LeMay's bombers had done what no navy could. They had cut the arteries of war. When the first incendiary raids began, Japanese commanders were confident they could rebuild. But within weeks, they realized the truth. Their logistics were dead. Train lines were shattered, depots leveled, and factories without power. The few ships still afloat had to scavenge for coal and crude. Naval aircraft sat useless on runways, engines idle for lack of gasoline. One admiral described it bitterly in his diary. "We have ships without oil, planes without wings, and men without hope." The great Yamato herself, the largest battleship ever built, was ordered on a suicide mission in April 1945.
With barely enough fuel for a one-way trip, she was to beach herself on Okinawa and become a fortress gun platform. She never made it. American aircraft, hundreds of them, swarmed her from the sky, dropping torpedoes and bombs in waves. Within 2 hours, she capsized and exploded, taking over 3,000 men with her. It was not just the death of a ship. It was the death of an idea that the sea would always protect Japan. By summer, the once feared Imperial Navy was reduced to scattered remnants, submarines hiding in coastal shallows, destroyers rusting at anchor, aircraft carriers stripped for scrap. The Pacific, once their empire's domain, belonged entirely to the United States. And all of it, every defeat, every sunken ship, every sailor left stranded, traced back to the laughter that had dismissed America's ineffective bombers. The bombers hadn't merely destroyed ships, they had erased Japan's ability to build them.
Act 5. The Sky That Changed Everything. This act reveals how the transformation of American air power not only destroyed Japan's naval might, but also rewrote the very laws of warfare, proving that the future of combat would belong to the sky, not the sea. By mid-1945, Japan's empire was no longer held by force, only by memory. The great fleets that had once sailed proudly under the rising sun now lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Their remains, twisted turrets, shattered propellers, burned decks, marked the graves of an era. But above them, a new kind of empire reigned, an empire of wings. American aircraft now filled the skies in numbers once thought impossible. Thousands of B-29s, escorted by sleek fighters, flew in coordinated waves over the Japanese homeland. Their reach was total. From Kyushu to Hokkaido, there was nowhere the bombers could not go, no harbor that could hide a ship, no factory that could operate in peace. The Japanese Navy, once the sword of the empire, had become irrelevant. Ships couldn't move without being spotted. Convoys were annihilated before they reached open water. Radar, reconnaissance, and aerial refueling had turned the ocean from a shield into a graveyard. In Tokyo, the shift was undeniable. Commanders who had once sneered at clumsy American bombers now spoke of them with awe and fear. The air had become the battlefield, and it was a battlefield Japan could no longer control. Even within the imperial ranks, a silent reckoning began. Young pilots, trained for kamikaze missions, wrote final letters to their families. One wrote, "We were born to sail, but now we drown in the sky." At the same time, American strategy evolved further. The U.S. Navy and Air Forces began joint operations that fused precision and power. Carrier-based fighters clearing the skies, long-range bombers following to strike supply lines and industrial targets. It was total coordination, something Japan's rigid military hierarchy could never achieve. When the bombing campaign shifted from shipyards to cities, the devastation was absolute. By July 1945, more than 60 Japanese urban centers had been burned to the ground. The empire's arteries of steel and coal had turned to dust. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Japan's final naval chief, summed up the despair in his post-war testimony. He wrote, "The sea became our enemy, the air became their ally. We fought as men, but they fought as machines, and machines do not tire."
The transformation was irreversible. For centuries, empires had measured strength in tonnage of ships and guns. But after 1945, the world would measure power in altitude, payload, and range. The sky had changed everything. And in that shift, Japan's laughter had turned into silence. The silence of cities burned flat, fleets sunken, and a nation staring upward into a sky it no longer owned.
Act 6. The Final Blow. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Death of Strategy. This act confronts the devastating culmination of America's bombing evolution, when strategy transcended destruction and entered the realm of the unthinkable. By the summer of 1945, Japan was already dying by degrees. Its navy lay broken beneath the Pacific. Its cities were ashes, its factories silent. Yet the war machine, fueled by pride and denial, refused to stop. For American planners, the question was no longer if Japan would fall, but how to end it without losing 500,000 more lives. They had already built the ultimate bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. And now, inside one of those bomb bays, they carried something the world had never seen. It began with the Manhattan Project, a scientific gamble shrouded in secrecy. Years of research, billions of dollars, and the minds of the century's greatest physicists converged to create a weapon that could end wars by obliterating cities in seconds. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island. Its crew knew only the basics: the mission, the altitude, the target. The city's name was Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, fell silently for 43 seconds. Then the sky split open. A light brighter than the sun swallowed the city. Concrete turned to vapor. Shadows burned into walls. Within moments, 70,000 people ceased to exist. Thousands more burned, blinded, or wandered through the ruins in stunned silence. Hiroshima's rivers filled with the dead and dying, people trying to cool their skin that had turned to flame. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. This time, the weapon was stronger, Fat Man, and the result just as horrifying. The Imperial Navy's last dockyards, factories, and fuel depots vanished in a cloud of dust and death. In Tokyo, the laughter that had once filled strategy rooms was gone. The surviving admirals and generals sat in silence, faces gray with disbelief. Some refused to speak. Others wept. The empire they had promised would last 1,000 years had lasted barely 15. Emperor Hirohito, a man once treated as divine, now faced the unthinkable: surrender. On August 15th, his voice, trembling, human, reached the Japanese people over the radio for the first time. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was the sound of an empire collapsing under the weight of its own pride. The atomic bomb did not just destroy cities, it ended an age. Naval dominance, industrial warfare, and even the concept of distance itself had been rewritten. No longer could oceans or borders protect a nation. The sky had become the frontier of extinction. For Japan's commanders, it was a lesson learned too late. The war they had dismissed as unwinnable for the Americans had ended not with surrender on a battlefield, but with surrender to the very science they had once mocked.
Act 7. The Surrender and the Reckoning. This act reveals the final days of Japan's war cabinet, the silent struggle between pride and survival, and the haunting aftermath as a nation confronted the ruin born from its own arrogance. When word reached Tokyo that Hiroshima was gone, disbelief turned to denial. Many within the Imperial General Staff refused to accept it. The Japanese military had seen countless bombings, fire, destruction, death, but nothing like this. "A single bomb cannot destroy a city," said one admiral. "It must be propaganda." Then came Nagasaki, and the lie fell apart. The emperor summoned his war council on August 9, 1945. The meeting lasted through the night, filled with whispers and silences. Outside, Tokyo still smoldered from previous raids. The once proud navy lay scattered in harbors like skeletons. There were no more ships to sail, no more pilots to fly. For hours, the generals argued, surrender or death. Some wanted to fight to the end, to let every soldier and civilian die with honor. Others, their faces hollow and pale, understood that honor meant nothing if the nation no longer existed. Finally, Emperor Hirohito spoke, his voice soft, trembling, human. "We must endure the unendurable." With those words, 15 years of conquest ended in a single breath. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. For the first time in history, the people heard their emperor's voice on the radio. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, and of the suffering it would bring if the war continued. Civilians fell to their knees in the streets, weeping not only for defeat, but for the realization that everything they had been told about invincibility was a lie. The war had devoured their sons, their homes, their empire, and their future, all because their leaders had laughed when they should have listened. Across the Pacific, American airmen returned home as victors, but not as heroes. Many were haunted by what they had seen. Some dreamed of fire, others of cities glowing beneath their wings. A few refused medals altogether. We won, but I'm not sure what we became in the process. In the ruins of Tokyo, Japanese engineers and naval officers walked through their shipyards in silence. The same hands that once built destroyers and submarines now sifted through the ashes of burned steel. They found the wrecks of their own creation and understood at last the irony of their downfall. They had worshipped machines of war, and in the end, they were destroyed by machines beyond imagination. The Pacific had grown quiet. The laughter that once filled Japan's war rooms had turned into prayers whispered over ruins. Act 8. Ashes and Reflection. The Builders of Peace. This act explores the transformation of Japan and America after the war, how both nations, once locked in a cycle of destruction, turned to rebuilding, innovation, and reflection under the shadow of what they had created. When the fires burned out, the silence that followed was heavier than the smoke. Across Japan, cities that once glowed with industry now lay as gray fields of rubble. Hiroshima's heart was gone. Tokyo's skyline had vanished, and the seas that once echoed with the thunder of warships were now calm, haunted by the ghosts of fleets that would never sail again. But in that silence, something extraordinary began. The same precision that had built battleships and bombers now turned to building homes, schools, and railways. Engineers who had once forged weapons now forged the future. From the ruins of Kure and Yokosuka, shipyards reopened, not for warships, but for trade vessels. The factories of Nagoya, once used for aircraft, began producing cars and machinery. Japan was reborn, not through conquest, but through creation. Under American occupation, General Douglas MacArthur implemented reforms that rewrote the nation's foundations. The emperor renounced his divinity. The military was dismantled.
A new constitution enshrined peace as law. For the first time in centuries, Japan's survival would depend not on the strength of its navy, but on the ingenuity of its people. And in that transformation, a strange bond formed between former enemies. American soldiers who had once bombed these cities now helped rebuild them. Engineers who studied destruction now taught construction. The two nations, once locked in total war, began to collaborate in science, industry, and education. In time, Japan's rebirth astonished the world. The cities that once lay in ashes rose higher than before. Hiroshima became a symbol of peace. Tokyo, a metropolis of innovation. The lessons of the firestorm were not forgotten. They were carved into Japan's identity. But the laughter that once dismissed America's bombers still echoes faintly, not in arrogance now, but as a warning, a reminder of what happens when pride blinds vision, when strategy becomes myth, and when men forget that every weapon they forge may one day turn on themselves. On the other side of the Pacific, America also changed. The war had taught it the cost of power, not only in blood, but in conscience. The same minds that built the atomic bomb turned toward medicine, energy, and exploration. The sky that once rained fire now carried satellites, space shuttles, and dreams of peace beyond Earth. The age of the bomber had given birth to the age of the builder. And though the scars remained in memory, in soil, in sky, both nations carried forward a single shared truth, that creation, not destruction, is what endures.
Act 9. The Legacy of Fire. Lessons for the Modern World. This act examines how the Pacific Air War reshaped global military thought, human conscience, and the fragile balance between power and morality that defines the modern age. The smoke of war may have cleared, but its lessons still drift across history like ash. The destruction of Japan's fleet and cities did more than end a conflict. It redefined the nature of warfare itself. Before 1945, victory was measured in ships sunk, land captured, and armies destroyed. After 1945, the measure became potential, the capacity to end all life without warning. Japan had learned the cost of underestimating innovation. America had learned the cost of mastering it. The sky, once the battlefield of bombers, became the theater of deterrence. The Cold War followed swiftly as nations raced to build arsenals capable of annihilation. The logic of air power, speed, reach, precision, now governed the fate of the entire world. And beneath that vast new sky, humanity wrestled with a question that still lingers today. When does defense become destruction? Historians would later note that the same arrogance that blinded Japan's commanders before the firebombing also lived quietly in every superpower that followed. Each one believed their technology, their strategy, their ideology would keep them safe. But the air no longer belonged to nations. It belonged to science. And science has no loyalty, only consequence. From the ashes of Tokyo and Hiroshima rose two opposing forces, fear and progress. The fear created treaties, peace movements, and disarmament campaigns. The progress created satellites, space exploration, and the modern technological world. Both were born from the same firestorm. Even now, every satellite that circles Earth, every drone that flies above cities, carries the legacy of those lessons. Every hum of an engine in the sky echoes the same warning. The distance between creation and destruction is thinner than smoke. And yet, from that devastation also emerged a miracle, a fragile peace between former enemies, bound not by conquest, but by understanding.
The United States and Japan would go on to become allies, their partnership symbolizing what humanity is capable of when it chooses connection over domination. The engineers who once built bombers would go on to design passenger planes. The cities that burned would lead the world in innovation, art, and culture. The enemies who once measured each other's strength in destruction would one day share it in creation. That is the paradox of fire. It consumes, but it also purifies. It leaves behind the truth that outlives every empire, that no technology, no army, no fleet, no bomb will ever be stronger than the human capacity to rebuild.
Act 10. Echoes in the Sky. The final reflection and call to action. This final act closes the journey, transforming the story of arrogance and ruin into a meditation on memory, legacy, and the human responsibility that endures beneath every sky. The war ended 80 years ago. The smoke has long since drifted away. Yet when the wind is right and the world grows quiet, you can still hear it. The echo of propellers, the whisper of fire, the hum of history circling above. The Japanese commanders who once laughed at American bombers are gone, their fleets rusting beneath the Pacific. The bombers, too, are gone, their wings scattered in museums, their names etched into plaques no one reads. But what remains is far greater than wreckage or victory. It is the story of how human pride can blind us, and how human ingenuity can both save and destroy. The Americans learned to build machines that could reach across oceans, but the real triumph was not their power. It was what came after, when they used that same brilliance to rebuild the very nations they once destroyed. The Japanese learned that technology without humility is disaster. The Americans learned that victory without reflection is hollow. Together, they proved that progress and morality must share the same cockpit, or the sky itself will turn against us. Every invention carries a question. Will this connect us or consume us? From the flames of Tokyo to the silence of Hiroshima, from the wreck of the Yamato to the gleam of modern Tokyo Tower, that question remains unanswered, left for us to decide. Because the war was never just about bombs, fleets, or fire. It was about understanding. Understanding that every strategy born from arrogance plants the seed of its own defeat. Understanding that creation without conscience leads only to ash. And understanding that, in the end, the true power of humanity is not in how we destroy, but in how we rebuild. The sky remembers everything, and sometimes it whispers the same warning back to us. They laughed once, and then the world burned. So we listen, we remember, and we build, wisely this time. History isn't just something we remember, it's something we choose to repeat or to transcend. The men who built, bombed, and rebuilt the skies left us one final warning. Power without wisdom is suicide, and progress without empathy is war by another name. If this story moved you, share it. Let it fly farther than any bomber ever did. Subscribe to Hidden Frontlines, where we keep the forgotten lessons of history alive, and the echoes of courage and conscience never fade.